Continuing Agis from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. At the first proposal she was very averse, and strongly advised her son not to engage in so difficult and so unprofitable an enterprise, but Agesilaus endeavored to possess her, that the thing was not so difficult as she imagined, and that it might, in all likelihood, redound to the advantage of her family, while the king her son besought her not, for money's sake, to decline assisting his hopes of glory. He told her he could not pretend to equal other kings in riches, the very followers and menials of the satraps and stewards of Seleucus or Ptolemy, abounding more in wealth than all the Spartan kings put together. But if by contempt of wealth and pleasure, by simplicity and magnanimity, he could surpass their luxury and abundance, if he could restore their former equality to the Spartans, then he should be a great king indeed. In conclusion, the mother and the grandmother also were taken, so carried away with the inspiration, as it were, of the young man's noble and generous ambition, that they not only consented, but were ready on all occasions to spur him on to a perseverance, and not only sent to speak on his behalf with the men with whom they had an interest, but addressed the other women also, knowing well that the Lacedaemonian wives had always a great power with their husbands, who used to impart to them their state affairs with greater freedom than the women who would communicate with the men in the private business of their families, which was, indeed, of the greatest obstacles to this design, for the money of Sparta, being most of it in the women's hands, because women were the gold and stuff like that, right? It was their interest to oppose it, not only as depriving them of those superfluous trifles in which, through want of better knowledge and experience, they placed their chief felicity, but also because they knew their riches were the main support of their power and credit. And also, women were technically like the banker for the husband, that the husband brought home the money and the woman stored it away, and the woman was there to be there to guard it and whatnot. But those, therefore, who were of this faction had recourse to Leonidas, representing to him how it was his part, as the elder and more experienced, to put a stop to the ill-advised projects of a rash young man. Leonidas, though of himself sufficiently inclined to oppose Agis, durst not openly for fear of the people, who were manifestly desirous of this change, but underhand he did all he could to discredit and thwart the project, and to prejudice the chief magistrates against him, and on all occasions craftily insinuated that it was at the price of letting him usurp arbitrary power that Agis thus proposed to divide the property of the rich among the poor, and that the object of these measures for cancelling debts and dividing the lands was not to furnish Sparta with citizens, but purchase him a tyrant's bodyguard. Agis, nevertheless, little regarding these rumors, procured Lysander's election as ephor, and then took the first occasion of proposing through him his rhetra to the council, the chief articles of which were these: that every one should be free from their debts, all the lands to be divided into equal portions, those that lay betwixt the watercourse near Pellene and Mount Taugetus, and as far as the cities of Malea and Salacia, into 4,500 lots. That's what makes pagan, not some difference of religion, the dividing of the countryside into lots for farming and stuff. The remainder into 15,000, these last, to be shared out among those of the country people who were fit for service as heavy armed soldiers, the first among the natural-born Spartans, and their number also should be supplied from any among the country people, are strangers who had received the proper breeding of freemen, and were of vigorous body and of age for military service. All these were to be divided into 15 companies, some of the 400 and some of the 2, with a diet and discipline agreeable to the laws of Lycurgus. This decree, being proposed in the council of elders, met there with opposition, so that Lysander immediately convoked the great assembly of the people, to whom he, Mandorclidas, and Agesilaus made orations, exhorting them that they would not suffer the majesty of Sparta to remain abandoned to contempt, to gratify a few rich men, who lorded it over them, but that they should call to mind the oracles in old times which had forewarned them to beware of the love of money, as the great danger and probable ruin of Sparta, and moreover those recently brought from the temple of Pasiphae. This was a famous temple, an oracle at Thelema, and this Pasiphae, some say, was one of the daughters of Atlas, who had by Jupiter a son called Ammon. Others are of opinion it was Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam, who, dying in this place, was called Pasiphae, as the revealer of oracles to all men. Plutarch says that this was Daphne, the daughter of Amyclas, who, flying from Apollo, was transformed into a laurel, honored by that entity with the gift of prophecy. All sorts of cultures do this, but when they focus on, I think there's a reason why, like in Africa and stuff like this, they tell us more of these stories from Africa that, oh, some ridiculous story that this person became this, and that's why we have this plant or animal or something. And those sorts of origin stories. I think there's, that they were just as common with Europe. But be it as it will, it is certain the people were made to apprehend that this oracle had commanded them to return to their former state of equality, settled by Lycurgus. As soon as these had done speaking, Agis stood up, and after a few words told them he would make the best contribution in his power to the new legislation which was proposed for their advantage. In the first place, he would divide among them all his patrimony, which was of large extent in tillage and pasture. He would also give 600 talents in ready money, and his mother, grandmother, and his other friends and relations, who were the richest of the Lacedaemonians, were ready to follow his example. The people were transported with admiration of the young man's generosity, and with joy that after 300 years' interval at last there had appeared a king worthy of Sparta. But on the other side, Leonidas was now more than ever averse, being sensible that he and his friends would be obliged to contribute with their riches, and yet all the honor and obligation would redound to Agis. He asked him then before them all whether Lycurgus were not, in his opinion, a wise man and a lover of his country. Agis answering, he was. And when did Lycurgus replied, Leonidas, cancel debts, or admit strangers to citizenship. He who thought the commonwealth not secure unless from time to time the city was cleared of all strangers. Yeah, that's not quite the right approach. To this Agis replied, it is no wonder that Leonidas, who was brought up and married abroad, and has children by a wife taken out of a Persian court, should know little of Lycurgus or his laws. Lycurgus took away both debts and loans by taking away money, and objected, indeed, to the presence of men who were foreign to the manners and customs of the country, not in any case from an ill will to their persons, but lest the example of their lives and conduct should infect the city with the love of riches and of delicate and luxurious habits, for it is well known that he himself gladly kept Terpander, Thales, and Pherecydes, though they were strangers, because he perceived that they were in their poems and in their philosophy of the same mind with him. And you that are wont to praise Ec Prepes, who being Ephor, cut with his hatchet, 2 of the 9 strings from the instrument of Phronis the magician, and to commend those who afterwards imitated him in cutting the strings of Timotheus's harp. With what face can he blame us for designing to cut off superfluity and luxury and display from the commonwealth? Do you think those men were so concerned only about a lute string, or intended anything else than to check in music that same excess, that extravagance, which rule in our present lives and manners, and have disturbed and destroyed all the harmony and order of our city? From this time forward, as the common people followed Agis, so the rich men adhered to Leonidas. They besought him not to forsake their cause, and with persuasions and entreaties so far prevailed with the council of elders, whose power consisted in preparing all laws before they were proposed to the people, that the designated rhetra was rejected, though but by only 1 vote, whereupon Lysander, who was still ephor, resolving to be revenged on Leonidas, drew up an information against him, grounded on 2 old laws. The one forbids any of the blood of, I don't know how it's spelled, you say Hercules, but Hercules, to raise up the children by a foreign woman, and the other makes it capital for a Lacedaemonian to leave his country to settle among foreigners. Whilst he set others on to manage this accusation, he with his colleagues went to observe the sign, which was a custom they had, and performed in this manner. Every 9th year the ephors, choosing a starlight night, when there is neither cloud nor moon, sit down together in quiet and silence, and watch the sky, and if they chance to see the shooting of a star, they presently pronounce their king guilty of some offense against what they consider to be gods and goddesses, and thereupon he is immediately suspended from all exercise of regal power till he is relieved by an oracle from Delphi or Olympia. Well, what if the demon is really the the demons among the gathering is really their gathering, and they're seeing this sign that maybe these oracles that are coming to them aren't but they're not getting that right. You can interpret these things one way or the other. It's but certainly isn't proof of wrongdoing of somebody that, a shooting star, I see a shooting star, somebody did something wrong. Yeah. Lysander, therefore, assured the people he had seen a star shoot, and at the same time Leonidas was cited to answer for himself. Witnesses were produced to testify that he had married an Asian woman, bestowed on him by one King Seleucus's lieutenants, that he had 2 children by her, but she so disliked and hated him that against his wishes, flying from her, he was in a manner forced to return to Sparta, where his predecessor dying without issue, he took upon him the government. Lysander, not content with this, persuaded also Cleombrotus to lay claim to the kingdom. He was of the royal family and son-in-law to Leonidas, who, fearing now the event of this process, fled as a suppliant to the temple of Minerva of the brazen house, together with his daughter, the wife of Cleombrotus, for she in this occasion resolved to leave her husband and to follow her father. Leonidas being again cited and not appearing, they pronounced a sentence of disposition against him, and made Cleombrotus king in his place. Yeah, if you can't get things at home in order. But then again, some couples, it's not really their thing to be together. Soon after this revolution, Lysander, his year expiring, went out of his office, and new ephors were chosen, who gave Leonidas assurance of safety, and cited Lysander and Mandroclidas to answer for having, contrary to the law, I don't know if that's supposed to be concealed or canceled. It's a misspelling of either. Cancelled debts, and designed a new division of lands. They, seeing themselves in danger, had recourse to the 2 kings, and represented to them how necessary it was for their interests and safety to act with unified authority, and bid defiance to the Epirs, for indeed the power of the Epirs, they said, was only grounded on the dissensions of the kings, it being their privilege, when the kings differed in opinion, to add to their suffrage to whichever they judged to have given the best advice. But when the two kings were unanimous, none ought or durst resist their authority. The magistrate whose office it was to stand as umpire when they were at variance had no call to interfere when they were of one mind. Agis and Clembratus, thus persuaded, went together with their friends into the marketplace, where, removing the Ephors from their seats, they placed others in their room, of whom Agesilaus was one, proceeding then to arm a company of young men, and releasing many out of prison, so that those of the contrary faction began to be in great fear of their lives, but there was no blood spilt. On the contrary, Agis, having notice that Agesilaus had ordered a company of soldiers to lie in wait for Leonidas to kill him as he fled to Tegea, immediately sent some of his followers to defend him and to convey him safely into that city. Thus far all things proceeded prosperously, none daring to oppose, but though the sordid weakness of one man, these promising beginnings were blasted, and a most noble and truly Spartan purpose overthrown and ruined by the love of money. Agesilaus, as we said, was much in debt, though in possession of one of the largest and best estates in land, and while he was gladly joined in this design to be quit of his debts, he was not at all willing to part with his land. Therefore he persuaded Agis that if both these things should be put in execution at the same time, so great and so sudden an alteration might cause some dangerous commotion, but if debts were in the first place cancelled, the rich men would afterwards more easily be prevailed with to part with their land. Lysander also was of the same opinion, being deceived in like manner by the craft of Agesilaus, so that all men were presently commanded to bring in their bonds or deeds of obligation by the Lacedaemonians, called Claria, at the marketplace, where, being laid together in a heap, they set fire to them. The wealthy, money-lending people, one may easily imagine, beheld it with a heavy heart, but Agesilaus told them scoffingly, his eyes had never seen so bright and so pure a flame. And now the people pressed earnestly for an immediate division of lands, and the kings also had ordered it should be done. But Agesilaus, sometimes pretending one difficulty, and sometimes another, delayed the execution, till an occasion happened to call Agis to the wars. The Achaeans, in virtue of a defense treaty of alliance, sent to demand succors, as they expected every day that Attalians would attempt to enter Peloponnesus from the territory of Megara. They had sent Aratus, their general, to collect forces to hinder this incursion. Aratus wrote to the Ephors, who immediately gave order that Agis should hasten to their assistance with the Lacedaemonian auxiliaries. Agis was extremely pleased to see the zeal and bravery of those who went with him upon this expedition. They were, for the most part, young men and poor, and being just released from their debts and set at liberty, and hoping on their return to receive each man his lot of land, they followed their king with wonderful alacrity. The cities through which they passed were in admiration to see how they marched from one end of the Peloponnesus to the other, without the least disorder, and in a manner without being heard. It gave the Greeks occasion to discourse with one another how great might be the temperance and modesty of a Laconian army in old time under the famous captains Agesilaus, Lysander, or Leonidas. Since they saw such discipline and exact obedience under a leader who perhaps was the youngest man in all the army, they saw also how he was himself content to fare hardly, ready to undergo any labors, and not to be distinguished by pomp or richness of habit or arms, from the meanest of his soldiers, and to the people in general it was an object of regard and admiration. But Richmond viewed the innovation with dislike and alarm, lest haply the example might spread and work changes to their prejudice in their own countries as well. Agis joined Aratus near the city of Corinth, where it was still a matter of debate whether or no it were expedient to give the enemy battle. Agis on this occasion showed great forwardness and resolution, yet without temerity or presumption. He declared it was his opinion that they ought to fight, thereby to hinder the enemy from passing the gates of Peloponnesus, but nevertheless he would submit to the judgment of Aratus, not only as the elder and more experienced captain, but as he was general of the Achaeans, whose forces he would not pretend to command, but was only come thither to assist them. I am not ignorant of that Baton of Sinope relates it in another manner. He says, Aratus would have fought, and that Agis was against it, but it is certain he was mistaken, not having read what Aratus himself wrote in his own justification, that knowing the people had well nigh got in their harvest, he thought it much better to let the enemy pass than put all to the hazard of a battle, and therefore giving thanks to the Confederates for their readiness, he dismissed them, and Agis, not without having gained a great deal of honor, returned to Sparta, where he found the people in disorder, and a new revolution imminent, owing to the ill government of Agesilaus, for he, being now one of the ephors, and freed from the fear which formerly kept him in some restraint, forbore no kind of oppression which might bring in gang. Among other things, he exacted a 13th month's tax, whereas the usual cycle required at this time no such addition to the year. For these and other reasons, fearing those whom he injured, and knowing how he was hated by the people, he thought it necessary to maintain a guard which always accompanied him to the magistrate's office, and presuming now on his power, he was grown so insolent that of the two kings, the one he openly contemned, and if he showed any respect towards Agis, would have it thought rather an effect of his near relationship than any duty or submission to the royal authority. He gave it out also that he was to continue ephor for the ensuing year. His enemies, therefore, alarmed by this report, lost no time in risking an attempt against him, and openly bringing back Leonidas from Tegea, re-established him in the kingdom, to which even the people, highly incensed for having been defrauded in the promised division of lands, willingly consented. Agesilaus himself would hardly have escaped their fury. If his son, Hippomedon, whose manly virtues made him dear to all, had not saved him out of their hands, and then privately conveyed him from the city. During the commotion, the two kings fled. Agis to the temple of the Brazen House, and Cleombrotus to that of Neptune, for Leonidas was more incensed against his son-in-law, and leaving Agis alone, he went with his soldiers to Cleombrotus's sanctuary, and there with great passion reproached him for having, though he was son-in-law, conspired with his enemies, usurped his throne, and forced him from the country. Cleombrotus, having little to say for himself, sat silent. His wife, Chilonis, the daughter of Leonidas, had chosen to follow her father in his sufferings, for when Cleombrotus usurped the kingdom, she forsake him, and wholly devoted herself to comfort her father in his affliction, whilst he still remained in Sparta. She remained also as a suppliant with him, and when he fled, she fled with him, bewailing his misfortune, and extremely displeased with Cleombrotus. But now upon this time of fortune she changed in like manner, and was seen sitting now as a suppliant with her husband, embracing him with her arms, and having her two little children besides her, all men were full of wonder at the piety and tender affection of the young woman, who, pointing to her robes and her hair, both alike neglected and unattended to, said to Leonidas, I am not brought, my father, to this condition you see me in on account of the present misfortunes of Clembratus. My mourning habit is long since familiar to me. It was put on to condole with you in your banishment, and now you are restored to your country, and to your kingdom I must remain in grief and misery. Would you have me attired in my royal ornaments, that I may rejoice with you when you have killed within my arms the man to whom you gave me for a wife? Either Clembratus must appease you by mine and my children's tears, or he must suffer a punishment greater than you propose for his faults, and shall see me, whom he loves so well, die before him. To what end should I live, or how shall I appear among the Spartan women when it shall be so manifestly seen that I have not been able to move to compassion either a husband or a father? I was born, it seems, to participate in the ill fortune and in the disgrace, both as a wife and as a daughter, of those nearest and dearest to me. As for Clembratus, I sufficiently surrendered any honorable plea on his behalf when I forsook him to follow you. But you yourself offer the fairest excuse for the proceedings, by showing to the world that for the sake of a kingdom it is just to kill a son-in-law and be regardless of a daughter. Well, it's not that simple. I mean, sure, the government may approve of you and that sort of thing, but, government approval isn't exactly the same thing as it being the right thing. Kilanis, having ended this lamentation, rested her face on her husband's head, and looking round with her weeping and woe-begone eyes upon those who stood before her, Leonidas, touched with compassion, withdrew a while to advise with his friends, then returning bade Clembratus leave the sanctuary and go into banishment. Kilanis, he said, ought to stay with him. It not being just, she should forsake a father whose affection had granted to her intercession the life of her husband. But all he could say would not prevail. She rose up immediately, and taking one of her children in her arms, gave the other to her husband, and making her reverence to the altar of what was considered to be the goddess. It's lowercase, so it's a particular one, right? Not the. Went out and followed him, so that, in a word, if Clembratus were not utterly blinded by ambition, he must surely choose to be banished with so excellent a woman rather than without her to possess a kingdom. Was it Athena or who? I guess it doesn't matter too much who they were worshiping. Clembratus, thus removed, Leonidas proceeded also to displace the ephors and to choose others in their room. Then he began to consider how he might entrap Agis. At first he endeavored by fair means to persuade him to leave the sanctuary and partake with him in the kingdom. The people, he said, would easily pardon the errors of a young man ambitious of glory and deceived by the craft of Agesilaus. But finding Agis was suspicious and not to be prevailed with to quit his sanctuary, he gave up that design. Yet what could not then be effected by the dissimulation of an enemy was soon after brought to pass by the treachery of friends. Ampharis, Democharis, and Arcesilaus often visited Agis, and was so confident of their fidelity that after a while he was prevailed on to accompany them to the baths, which were not far distant, they constantly returning to see him safe again in the temple. They were all three his familiars, and Ampharis had borrowed a great deal of plate and rich household stuff from Agesistrata, and hoped if he could destroy her and the whole family he might peaceably enjoy these goods. And he, it is said, was readiest of all to serve the purpose of Leonidas, and being one of the ephors, did all he could to incense the rest of his colleagues against Agis. These men, therefore, finding that Agis would not quit his sanctuary, but on occasion would venture from it to go to the bath, resolved to seize him on the opportunity thus given them. And one day, as he was returning, they met and saluted him as formerly, conversing pleasantly by the way and jesting as youthful friends might, till coming to the turning of a street which led to the prison, Amphares, by virtue of his office, laid his hand on Agis and told him, "You must go with me, Agis, before the other ephors to answer for your misdemeanors." At the same time, Demochares, who was a tall, strong man, drew his cloak tight around his neck and dragged him after by it, whilst the others went behind to thrust him on, so that none of Agis's friend being near to assist him, nor anyone by, they easily got him into the prison, where Leonidas was already arrived with a company of soldiers who strongly guarded all the avenues. The ephors also came in, with as many as the elders as they knew to be true to their party, being desirous to proceed with some semblance of justice, and thus they bade him give an account of his actions, to which Agis, smiling at their dissimulation, answered not a word. Amphares told him it was more sensible to weep, for now the time was come in which he should be punished for his presumption. Another of the ephors, as though he would be more favourable, and offering, as it were, an excuse, asked him whether he was not forced to what he did by Agesilaus and Lysander. But Agis answered he had not been constrained by any man, nor had any other intent in what he did, but only to follow the example of Lycurgus and to govern comfortably to his laws. The same ephor asked him whether now at least he did not repent his rashness, to which the young man answered that, though he were to suffer the extremest penalty for it, yet he could never repent of so just and so glorious a design. Upon this they passed sentence of death on him, and bade the officers carry him to the Decus, as it is called, a place in the prison where they strangle malefactors. And when the officers would not venture to lay hands on him, and the very mercenary soldiers declined it, believing it an illegal and wicked act to lay violent hands on a king, Demochares, threatening and reviling them for it, himself thrust him into the room, for by this time the news of his being seized had reached many parts of the city, and there was a concourse of people with lights and torches about the prison gates, and in the midst of them the mother and grandmother of Agis, crying out with a loud voice that their king ought to appear and to be heard and judged by the people. But this clamor, instead of preventing, hastened his death, his enemies fearing if the tumult should increase he might be rescued during the night out of their hands. Agis, being now at the point to die, perceived one of the officers bitterly bewailing his misfortune. "Weep not, friend," said he, "for me who die innocent by the lawless act of wicked men. My condition is better than theirs." As soon as he had spoken these words, not showing the least sign of fear, he offered his neck to the noose. Now, these people threatening police and politicians and stuff like this, I think, rather than giving in, make it less what they want, right? Immediately after he was dead, Amphares went out of the prison gate, where he found Agesistrata, who, believing him still the same friend as before, threw herself at his feet. He gently raised her up and assured her that she need not fear any further violence or danger of death for her son, and that if she pleased she might go in and see him. She begged her mother might also have the favor to be admitted, and he replied nobody should hinder it. When they were entered, he commanded the gate should again be locked, and Archidamia, the grandmother, to be first introduced. She was now grown very old, and had lived all her days in the highest repute among her fellows. As soon as Amphares thought she was dispatched, he told Agesistrata she might now go in if she pleased. She entered, and beholding her son's body stretched on the ground,